So I'm a complete hypocrite in that I always sort of take a step back when anyone asks me about my own collection. And I was interviewed a couple of years ago for Artsy for a piece on young collectors. And I was like, I'm not a collector, so I'm a complete hypocrite. When I'm trying to encourage people to call themselves that. I don't see collecting as hierarchical in terms of scale or volume at all. I see it in terms of intent.
Hello and welcome back to the Collector's Corner with me, Antonia Piersanti. If there's one thing I'm learning with this podcast, is that collectors come in all shapes and sizes. There is no single or right way to collect. So that's why I was super interested in speaking to Liza Shapiro and Georgia Powell, the founders of CURA Art, to get a little bit more of a meta view on this topic. Georgia and Liza first met at the Redfern Gallery in London in 2013. They immediately hit it off. It took them a few years to realize their shared vision, but in 2019, they launched CURA Art together. And since then, between London and Los Angeles, they've been supporting hundreds of private and corporate collectors in the ongoing care and management of their collections. Georgia and Liza care deeply about the art they look after on behalf of their clients. And as a matter of fact, I don't think they could have come up with a better name for their company. However, what motivates them above everything else is developing very personal relationships with their clients to really help them build collections thoughtfully, with purpose, integrity, and intent, and ultimately allow them to embrace their role as custodians. So, what differences are there between seasoned and new collectors? How do the London and LA art cultures compare? What is really the biggest threat to any art collection? Georgia and Liza share fascinating insights on this and more. But I'll stop here. I'll leave you to enjoy my conversation with Georgia Powell and Liza Shapiro of CURA Art. And as per usual, all the references are in the show notes. Yeah, Liza, Georgia, it's a pleasure to have you today. Thank you so much for joining me on the podcast to talk about CURA Art. To begin with, I'd like to go back a little bit to the origin story. And back when you were working at the Redfern Gallery together, what made you realize that there was a gap in the market to help collectors care for and manage their collections? Was there any specific stories or moment where you realized this is really something where people need support with?
Yeah, I'm happy to start. Thank you for having us, first and foremost. But yes, as you mentioned, we met working at the Redfern Gallery. Georgia was managing the gallery at the time, and I was hired to archive a lot of the prints and drawings there and create a system that Georgia had already started, but that was ongoing in terms of the care of the prints and drawings. But really, what I think the light bulb moment for us was so many people would come into the gallery and ask us questions about framing and conservation and display and, you know, who do I go see to get this conserved, etc. Um, and it felt at the time, especially, there wasn't a service unless you're maybe acquiring something from a big auction house or a really well-known gallery where they could kind of help you to a certain extent. It felt like there wasn't that service that offered that support and care of the collection post acquisition. So that was kind of the light bulb moment that Georgia and I had. And we actually developed the idea for CURA Art within a week of meeting each other. So it happened quite quickly. It just took us a few years to execute it.
And what does it look like working with you as a collector or an art owner? How does the sort of first interaction happen? And then what are the ways they can work with you, or how do you typically work with them?
We were witnessing individuals asking all of the questions that Liza mentioned, and also an interest from the two of us. Like Liza had studied conservation, I had gone down the more usual art history route, and we thought that by coming together we could fill that gap. Liza and I are incredibly close, and we're friends alongside starting this business. And what I hope that comes out at the other end is that we really genuinely care about what we do. It's not simply a case of us finding a gap in the market. Like, we actually really want to work with individuals that are custodians to help them with that. So I hope what it feels like as the end user is that we profess to encourage people to collect with care, but I hope they really feel that care from Liza and I, because at the end of the day, we're all here working in this industry that is very much about, at the root of it, understanding our existence and humanity. And it's very personal and it's very emotion driven. And I think there needs to be an emphasis on that human side. So I hope that's what people feel from us, is that it's two humans behind all of this that really, really care about what they do.
It reminds me of one of your core principles, right? Is collecting with purpose. So what do you mean by that?
We had worked in a gallery and not only witnessed those questions, but also seen that galleries and other specialists don't necessarily have the time to really dedicate and delve into a collection. So in terms of how the business has developed beyond that, we've really, through having these very close connections to those that we work with and having conversations with them, we've realized that there is this need for the very kind of practical, logistical, inventory management advice with insurance and conservation and all of those kind of core collections management side of things, but also individuals, and increasingly so, wanting to do so with purpose, with integrity, with thoughtfulness. I feel like across the board, we're seeing collecting shift into something that is more sort of conscientious and thoughtful. And so I think as a business, we have also expanded into that realm of how do we support that, listening to the demographic that we want to work with. How can we support, as you say, collecting with purpose? What does that actually look like? And what we're seeing is individuals that, perhaps in response to the institutions having less resources and the art market shifting, wanting to provide very direct support to artists, wanting to support institutions, wanting to create initiatives either by themselves or in partnership with institutions. And we are actually seeing a lot of emphasis on that care and purposeful collecting. And it feels like the market is shifting towards that.
Going back to your question too, just to add that, we work with clients that collect. It could be big collections or someone that's just starting to collect. But I think this purposeful collecting, we want to kind of encourage that from the start. So whether you're, someone that's kind of just getting into it, or a really seasoned collector who, has hundreds and hundreds of works in their collections and is engaged in museum loans and ongoing support to institutions like Georgia mentioned, we really want it to be that full spectrum and for it to be accessible.
You mentioned new collectors, more seasoned collectors. What are the differences you see between the way you work with new collectors and seasoned collectors?
I think a key difference, to be frank, is that seasoned collectors understand what goes into actually having a collection, and really managing the collection long term, creating a legacy. It can be anything from the need for appraisals and, well, more in here in the US, and insurance and conservation and all of these things that need to be done. And I think for the emerging collector, sometimes it takes a moment to understand all of those things, but also understand the potential of collecting. There's kind of going back to that collecting with purpose. I think there's so much beyond the joy of it. There is also so much potential and ways to kind of go about your collecting practice.
Do you have some examples of like stories of where you've seen like a really nice progression maybe, or really interesting progression of a collector, or you were there from the beginning of their journey until now, I guess, where they may be a bit more seasoned?
I think even just that word collector, we recently had a talk in Los Angeles that actually featured a client of Liza's that's probably her longest standing client. We had a conversation with him about even getting to the point where he felt comfortable using the term collectors. So when you're talking about the difference between, those that are just starting out and seasoned, I think it's even, taking them on a journey that they feel that they can take on the responsibilities of that role and everything that goes into it. I think even just getting people to that stage to acknowledge that they're a collector. And so that's what I find the most fulfilling, to be honest, is, as Liza says, kind of going with them on that journey as they figure it out, and realizing that you don't need to know everything at the beginning.
Yeah.
um and I think we're so inundated with art, through so many different ways. I think what we're seeing is a generation of collectors that are somewhat overwhelmed and intimidated by all the ways to access art.
Yeah.
The infrastructures that existed before made it, there were only a few entry points into it, and it's absolutely wonderful that it's made more accessible, but also that it can seem overwhelming. So I personally have a client that reached out, and it's one of my favorite stories to tell, because quite honestly, most of the work that we have is through recommendation. It's just the nature of what we do. People recommend us, thankfully. But one person that's now turned out to be a long-term client of mine Googled collecting with purpose and found us. And she had acquired works, as many people do, throughout her life, some with her husband, but some before they met. And they had, you know, surrounded themselves by things that they thought were interesting or beautiful, or whatever reason. And she'd got to the point where that part was interesting, but she'd sort of wanted to expand beyond that. And so we have helped her, think about what collecting means to her. And actually, she's learned through doing that. So we identified themes that ran through the works that she'd acquired, and she continues to acquire. We don't act as advisors in that part, but we assist her in sort of trying to make sense of the collection, and then also with, as I say, the sort of strategy or the thinking behind it. And she's identified that it's not just about the acquisition for her. She wants to give back. So we've done things like initiate a scheme with a accessibly priced artist studios in London, and she sponsors an artist studio each year. But that also helped the artist studio then launch a patron scheme. That was something we came up with together through identifying what she cared about, how her collecting practice is in line with her values and her ethos, and also the work that she does. So we're also having conversations. She does a lot of business coaching. How could that help artists? So
Yeah.
just trying to sort of make collecting practices aligned with people's way of life, the things that they care about, those types of things. And facilitating conversations like that, I think, is something that Liza and I care about a lot.
Yeah, it sounds like it's all about alignment, right? And helping people finding that. I can see how for some maybe occurs later in the collecting
Mm.
journey.
Yeah.
But you mentioned that with maybe the younger generation, that's something that they sometimes want to do from the get-go.
Yeah, I think so. Generally, I think, the world is a really complex place at the moment. And I think what, at least in Los Angeles, and I know there's, big differences between the clients we work with in Los Angeles and say London, for example. But I think at least in Los Angeles, I'm seeing maybe the more emerging collector, yeah, come out with a kind of real purpose of why they might be acquiring certain works, or wanting to support a specific artist directly. And that kind of goes back to what Georgia was saying with her client, is that we're seeing this, it's an incredible emphasis on really supporting artists. Georgia mentioned we did this discussion in Los Angeles during Freeze Week, and what my client was also talking about was being a patron and what that means, and kind of the feeling of, he didn't feel like that when he started collecting, but now he's able to maybe not acquire a work from an artist, but instead support in other ways, sponsor an event that artist is doing, pay for studio time, materials, engage in other ways. I think that's an example that the emerging collector is seen really in the forefront, in the news, in social media. And I think that's now happening in practice, maybe more so than in you know, previous years. I do.
It goes hand in hand with us being sort of more inundated with news, what's happening in the world, more sort of socially awake, but also there's so much access to artists and their personality and their studio practice as well as the actual finished works. And things have become a lot more human through things like Instagram. And so I think that you're more aware of the human behind the work. And so therefore I would imagine that's what's influenced this need to support them because you're more aware of that. And also I have a client who is just starting out and he said that he wants to feel part of his generation. He wants to feel like he's contributed. So I think there's that as well, like
Yeah.
people wanting to feel that they can make a difference within collecting.
And you mentioned briefly, Liza, the London versus Los Angeles differences, because my understanding is there are quite different collector cultures, even between Europe and maybe the US more broadly. How different are they in what respect? Because I keep hearing this, it's so different in the US, it's so different. So I'd love to hear it from you, both on the ground and living it every day.
It's funny. I lived in London for almost a decade, and now I've actually been back in Los Angeles for the same time that I lived in London, which feels really odd. And they're very different. I think, the collections that we work with here in Los Angeles, inherently they're more contemporary. The city is new. I think the LA culture directly affects what people collect.
How
Even like
so?
it's a casual city. There's streetwear, there's graffiti on the buildings. When you walk through Los Angeles, it's very different than what you feel when you walk through it than say walking through London. When I walk
Mm.
through London, these historic buildings, I feel part of history. LA feels like everything could happen right now. Like it feels like something's very active all the time. The buildings are constantly changing. You walk down the street and there's no sense of kind of controlled architecture. Every building is different, which I love about it. And it's hard to explain. I think a lot of it is like the feeling you get when you're here. Let's do an example of you're going on a night to a lot of galleries that have their openings, and you're kind of going from gallery to gallery. I would say Los Angeles is, like I said, a lot more casual. There is usually a bit more of a party vibe where kind of the community comes. I think LA is really resilient. It's about community. And I think it was really shown, to the world last
Mm.
year after the tragic fires that happened here. Right away, the arts community kind of banded together, and there was fundraisers. I mean, like the day after, it was kind of crazy. Funds being put together to help artists. The contemporary versus the more historical in terms of the collections that we manage is pretty outward facing. Not that, some collections here, of course, there's historic works and antiques and antiquities, but it's from the forefront, it feels a lot more contemporary.
Interesting.
I think Los Angeles is extremely different to New York. So I don't think you can think of it as like UK, US. I think they're very, very different. Where it's like people go there because they want to live on the precipice of something happening.
Yeah.
Whether that's like, the earthquake could happen at any given moment. It's
Yeah.
exciting. That sounds so strange, but I that you feel that. Like Liza says, it feels like something could happen any minute. And so
Yeah, I
that's
feel
really reflected.
like
Yeah, so you have all of the influence of the light and space movement. This romantic idea of Los Angeles is reflected, but also, it's really bold, the works. They're really like political and they're making a statement. And London seems different. London, as Liza says, is rooted in a longer tradition and less casual. Like you'll go to a private view in Los Angeles and everyone will be there with their dogs and their children.
More relaxed.
Yeah. Yeah. And you could argue that there's less pretense, which is
Okay.
certainly what I am interested in. It feels more artist driven. Things have definitely shifted, even in the 10 years that I've been traveling regularly to California and Los Angeles, but still it feels, yeah, less pretense. But don't get me wrong, I absolutely love the London art scene and I think there's really exciting things happening there. I felt so inspired by the previous Freeze London in October and the things like Echo Soho, this
Yeah.
new art fair that came
Yeah.
about, and so many galleries that I know and work with doing really interesting things. Like there's a lot happening.
There's a
It
lot,
feels
yeah.
exciting. It just feels different. It feels, in terms of what people are collecting, perhaps more emphasis on art historical references. We're definitely seeing that in
Do you
Europe.
mean historical references in contemporary work?
Mm.
Okay. Yeah, that's interesting.
Um,
And so how is that something that people explicitly mention to you, that this is something they look for? Or is this or you just sort of picked up on it?
no, it is something. I feel like it's going hand in hand with this sort of reassessment of art history. And it is, as well as individuals saying they want to feel part of history now. There's so many artists that we're witnessing that are quite directly referencing art historical
Yeah.
examples and drawing on them. And I definitely have conversations with individuals in London that are collecting that have an awareness of where an artist sits in art history, which I don't necessarily feel, and correct me if I'm wrong, guys, I don't think that there's the same emphasis in Los Angeles. It feels very much about now.
Yes, I agree in some respects, but I still think people are definitely aware of that in Los Angeles as well. I just think maybe it's less talked about, less
Yeah.
discussed.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. So it's more like an undercurrent, but
Mm.
less front of mind. That's interesting. I mean, genuinely, obviously, collecting is such a personal thing, and like each one of your clients is different. But it's quite intimate as well, right? So I'm sure by working with people's collection, it teaches you a lot about them, or you learn a lot about them. Like it's quite revealing in a way. So I was just curious, what have you learned in these contexts that you would have just never expected?
Generally, as you say, we are physically in people's homes a lot of the
Exactly.
time, cataloging, moving things around. We have a different relationship to them than, say, an advisor or a gallery, because we sell our services, but we're not necessarily trying to sell them something. And it's something that Liza and I decided very early on, that we wouldn't also be advisors alongside our collections management. And it means we do have a different
And why?
relationship.
Why did you decide that? Why did you make that decision early?
I feel like it's really important in life to do the part that interests you, but then also absolutely no disrespect to art advisors. We work with them on a daily basis, and galleries and those that are selling works to our clients and others. It just felt like if we were advising them, say for instance, on the condition of a work pre-acquisition, we may be influenced. We just felt that there was perhaps a conflict of interest.
Yeah, a bit of a conflict of
Yeah.
interest. And
Yeah.
as Georgia said, my background's in art conservation. Georgia's in art history, and it felt like between the two of us, we both studied historical painting, specifically the Renaissance. That's where we started. But I felt very clear that I wanted to work in a sector that had something to do with caring for artworks,
Yeah.
and that this felt like the natural way for us. Like Georgia said, we work with advisors on a daily basis. Advisors know firsthand what it takes to care and manage those collections, and they don't want to be the ones, creating a database and creating, kind of that ongoing system. And that's when we're called in. So it's a really nice synergy that happens. What surprised me so much, especially since moving to Los Angeles, is how much I love the installation process. I think, like Georgia said, being in, people's homes and really getting to know them in a personal way, and then being part of these installs and kind of the curatorial side more. And I think that's been something that we've actively developed over the last few years, and something that I just find so exciting and fun. So that's a joy. I'm always surprised at how much art can actually fit in someone's home. Like, when you think there's no more space, someone puts in, like, a really empty spot that completely works, and I think that's the fun of it.
Can I ask actually, Liza, why was it so important to you to work with the care aspects of artworks? Why does that resonate with you so deeply? What is it about that?
Well, I moved to Italy right out of after finishing high school here in Los Angeles, and I'm from a small town near Los Angeles called Ojai. And I enrolled in an Italian university in Florence, and I just started studying restoration when I was 17. So I knew from a really young age that I was not going to be an artist. I was always very interested in art. I did a lot of painting, throughout my childhood, but I just knew that that wasn't for me. So I think I had this pull to kind of understand artworks, and from restoration, I then moved to London to study conservation, but I just was always really fascinated by it. This kind of melting of the history, and you get to see the artworks that way in a really different light. I am not good as a salesperson. I knew that I wasn't going down that route. Georgia knows. So it was just very clear. I just knew from a
Mm,
young age that that was
yeah.
exactly what I wanted to do. I think coming from America too, I was completely overwhelmed when I got to Florence. I couldn't believe it that, buildings like that existed, that I was, seeing all the great masters that you only read about in books in person. I think I was just like, I get chills now when I'm talking about it. I was just completely blown away. And it was
Mm.
just very clear that that's what I was going to do. And, um, like Georgia said, we came up with the idea for CURA Art and so early on, but we also have been, dear friends this whole time too. And I think when things just kind of click, uh, it's just meant to be that way.
Yeah.
Mm.
Yeah, it's not necessarily easy to run a business as friends, but you seem to do really well at that.
I think it's a steep learning curve. I think we have learned, and this goes back to, what you were saying about surprises. I think the thing that I am learning as I get older is I had always put like this work hat on. Like, this is Georgia in work mode. And I think what I'm learning and what I love about having such a close relationship with our clients, it's really personal, is that you can actually be yourself, and that all of these different parts of you can come together. And, mine and Liza's lives are so enmeshed at this point. And I think we've learned, honestly, the hard way, and because we know each other so well and have put the work in, how to manage it. It's through just being, like, sometimes brutally honest with one another.
Georgia, I wanted to go back to something that you said earlier. Also, it reminded me of something I read that you said in a previous interview, which is that people shouldn't cling too much to the term collector when they're engaging with art. And that resonated because I've really noticed that in the people I speak with. There seems to be like some sort of unspoken rule that you can only call yourself a collector once you have, I don't know, a storage facility or something. So I was wondering what your take is on that, and how you encourage people to reframe the way they think about the collector and collecting in that regard?
It's something that Liza and I talk about frequently, and I often hearing perspectives different than my own, but this is just obviously my perspective in that I think that if you are acquiring works thoughtfully and acquiring works based on that sort of instinct that none of us can really put into words, where you just see something and you know that for whatever reason it's kind of hit you in the gut. So instinctually, thoughtfully, I think that's collecting, even if that's only three works. I don't see collecting as hierarchical in terms of scale or volume at all. I see it in terms of intent. And people would disagree with me on that, but that's just my opinion.
Why
Um,
would they disagree?
when I say people, I mean mainly collectors. It takes time for people to take on that role, that title. Even people that I would absolutely call collectors and have, been called collectors in articles and, publicly, they struggle with that term themselves. And I think people struggle with that because of all of the sort of gravitas and responsibility that goes alongside it. But me personally, I think that um, collecting should be non-hierarchical. I think it shouldn't be based on scale or volume or, value, or whether the artwork is deemed collectible in terms of the definitions that, you know,
Yeah.
are today, because that has shifted so much throughout our art history, what people should collect. So for me, it's more about the ethos in the individual rather than the works that they've acquired.
It was a refreshing take actually when I read that interview of yours, because it does there does seem to be, it's almost like the collectors put themselves under pressure. Like I've
Hmm,
embraced this route now. It's something I really want to do. I'm passionate about, but it comes with a lot of responsibility to be able to uphold that title of collector. And
absolutely, yeah. But going back to what we were saying previously, it feels like there is that pressure, and also just to not acquire works, but to also be doing all these other things as well. But we try and shift it. And, you know, as well as the actual doing the work, I think Liza and I also care about kind of shifting the ethos and the way people think about collecting. And I teach regularly at Christie's Education, just trying to get people to shift it from this idea of all of these responsibilities. Now I have these fragile things. And, we talk about custodianship and being responsible for art history and all of these things, but shifting it so that it's actually sort of a privilege and something that can be hugely impactful.
I'm glad you bring up custodianship, because I wanted to talk about that. It's definitely something that you mention a lot. So how do you help people think about that? So first, do people? I mean, you've sort of touched on that already, but the collectors you work with, are they aware of this custodian role? Is this something that they take to heart right off the bat, or is it something that they realize throughout the journey? Are they interested in being custodians? Curious to hear maybe some stories there as well.
I think it varies, and I also think depending on the collector, and also whether it's a collector or an organization or, you know, a hotel that's starting a collection and wants to directly support artists and do commissions. Like there's so many different ways that art is acquired. So I definitely think that shifts depending, this idea of stewardship. I hope that in the work that George and I do, we're educating collectors, but also even artists on kind of what it takes to be a steward of these works and really ensuring that they have a legacy. But I don't think that idea of stewardship comes that naturally unless maybe a collection was passed down to you, or you're in a big institution setting. I think this idea of being a steward is something that comes maybe a little later. Interestingly, we've spoken to a lot of artists about kind of their relationship with the preservation of their artworks and kind of how they can ensure that their works are also preserved and cared for by, the next person that has them in their lives. And even little admin things like making sure there's a label on the back or signing your work or ensuring that the materials that you use, that there's, even if you are a very contemporary artist and you want the work to degrade with time, that is okay. But having that information actually available to collectors, to advisors, to conservators, that's something that we talk about a lot, and I find super fascinating, is kind of how that information is passed through in time, especially with contemporary materials that artists are using now. So I think it really depends, this idea of stewardship, and I think it can vary a lot.
I think also a lot of collecting, there's this sort of romance that goes alongside it, and people want to collect artworks often because it offers them insight and you could argue sort of escapism. Like it provides a whole other world within their world for them
Mhm.
to understand themselves and humanity. And so people don't necessarily want to think about all the seemingly boring things that Liza and I do. They art is placed outside and it's shifting because art is increasingly seen as an asset. But people don't necessarily think about a collection in the same way that they would managing their home
Mm.
or their health or other things that require that kind of ongoing understanding. And so that's really what we try and encourage is just shifting that perspective to understanding that a collection is a living, breathing thing that does require ongoing maintenance. And I think there's this idea that the biggest threats and risks to collections are things like fires and thefts and things not being authenticated properly and all of those major things that are featured in the press often, which absolutely exist. But actually, the biggest threat to collections is people being misinformed and unaware of the what's called gradual deterioration, which actually isn't insured. That's when something, as the name suggests, gradually deteriorates because it's been put in a place that doesn't think of its preservation. And it's that kind of stuff. It's just having an awareness. And it's actually like, doesn't have to be intimidating or complex. It can be as simple as taking a photograph of a work in your collection once a year and being aware of the way that it looks and how that might have changed. It's just sort of changing that ethos to understanding that it's something that needs to be managed and maintained.
What do you think is the biggest blocker for people to understand that?
Sometimes it's just the understanding of actually like what goes into it. And as Georgia says, I think it can be just really intimidating. I think it's intimidation and lack of access to those tools. Um, and even from, we during the pandemic, we spoke to so many artists actually who were really interested. They maybe had some time in their studio to really think about like their materials and archiving their studies and how things were living on, and that was really interesting. I feel like I learned so much that time of really speaking to artists a little bit more about that. So I think it's access.
Also, collections management as a discipline is a museum discipline, really. And the way that the market has shifted has meant that the commercial side hasn't really so much caught up with the need for that, and increasingly so as, major masterpieces from history and the present day are increasingly ending up in private rather than public hands. There needs to be this realignment where, as Liza says, it's not accessible. This sort of information that to us seemed quite basic, like don't put an oil painting above a heat source. So that's why we care so much about, doing talks and making this type of information more readily accessible.
I was wondering in terms of the clients you work with, because Liza, you mentioned there's a difference between people who maybe are just getting started versus, inheriting a collection or having a family legacy. What What's the sort of breakdown? Do you feel like it's 50-50 or is there, you work more with people who already have or inherited a collection or man looking after an existing collection? And then there's the whole corporate clients as well. Like what would you say? How is it split?
I think this goes back to our LA, London comparison. I'm generalizing here, but I would say the collections that we work with or know in Los Angeles tend to be new, people acquiring, something all the time on a regular or at least on a regular basis. Whereas a lot of the collections that we work with or know in London maybe started from, a family interest or something that was passed down. And even if they're actively acquiring now, it seems more often that it started from something in history. Corporate collections, again, this is a generalization, but I feel like in America, it is more common to have these very large corporate collections where the company is actively acquiring artworks and supporting artists, via commissions. One of the incredible art advisors we work with here in Los Angeles, she's very active in artist commissions and public art. That's something that I would love to be more involved with in terms of the care, because that's a big one, especially when you're, putting artworks outside buildings and in elements such as that.
I think we're going to see more of that as well. Like we've just been included in Georgina Adams' new book about next generation collecting, and she talks a lot about this transfer of wealth that we're going to be seeing from all those boomers that made money post-war being transferred down through different generations. So I think we are going to be seeing a lot more of that inheritance and collections.
Interesting. Also, probably people who might inherit wealth but would like to start spending it on
Exactly.
arts and not
Exactly.
just passing down wealth that is locked into collections. Um,
Exactly.
tell me a little bit about corporate clients. Like, how different is it working with a corporate collection versus a private collector?
The same kind of considerations I think are still in play. Um, all the care considerations, the appraisals that are done every few years, the ongoing conservation. I actually think a lot of it is quite similar.
Do
The
they have like
install
someone who's appointed, whose full-time job it is to do that, work on that, the collection, or how does it work?
can happen both ways. For instance, in family offices, oftentimes there can be a collections manager, especially if they're actively acquiring. In corporate, in big corporate collections, like of course, like UBS and Bank of America, yes, they
Mhm.
have full time a full time, oftentimes team of people, working as collections managers. But in our experience with some of these corporate collections, that that's what we do. So we'll do the ongoing management care. Every time a work needs to be moved, we oversee the install and the logistics and kind of everything that goes into it.
And the acquisition process, I mean, I know you're a little less involved, but private collectors, they always talk about the emotional connection with the work and how it needs to speak to them. And yes, they have like a rational checklist of things they go through, but at the end of the day, they really need to like love it, right? How that's different for an organization. So is there what is the typical approach that you see there?
The actual collecting practice is different in that organizations have to be seen to be thoughtful and democratic, and they can't just base acquisitions on that emotion that you mentioned, whereas individuals do have the freedom to pick what resonates to them personally. So what you normally see is a group of individuals, like some kind of committee that comes together, and it's obviously has to be focused on different demographics. The overarching thing is that they have a responsibility towards collecting artists that are really sort of the innovators of any particular time, or doing things differently, or contributing to art history. That's the sort of it's very, very thoughtful and, as I say, democratic. whereas individuals can be responsive and emotionally driven.
What is one thing that you would like collectors to know or be aware of before they come to you? If there's like one thing you'd really like them to keep in mind, what would that be?
That for me, that's really easy. It's keep a copy of your invoice, please.
Why?
More often than not, Liza and I are called on sort of 20, 30 years into collecting, and then we have to try and piece together this massive jigsaw puzzle of where something was acquired when. It's all the amount of time that goes into that research part is huge. So if you could just keep a copy of the invoice, that would be fantastic. That's my one sage piece of advice.
What about you, Liza?
Documentation, like Georgia said before, taking photos. It doesn't need to be intimidating. It could be, you going, I just did it in my own home.
Go around with it and video and talk about it. Talk about it with
Yeah.
your friends. Like feel engaged with it. It's not just like I've bought this thing, I've put it on my wall. There's so much more that can come out of that.
You mentioned with the fires, there's a question I had about that. So when an artwork gets damaged, so you involved in the restoration as well? How does that work?
So post fires, we worked with a lot of incredible conservation teams here in Los Angeles. So we would go with the conservator to the, wherever the either where the home was or if the artworks had damage but still existed, and we would assess everything together. And then the treatment would then go directly to the conservation studio, and we would just manage all of that, ensure that everything was packed appropriately, handled appropriately with the art handlers that we work with, taken to the conservation studio. With things like fires, it was really crucial to have a very structured system in place and order. You have a clean room where everything's brought to afterwards. And then you also have the room, when artworks are brought in with, say, severe soot and smoke damage. So everything has to be, in that sense, it's a very managed, strict system. So I don't do active conservation myself anymore, but I'm very involved in things like condition reports and documentation before the conservator does their treatment.
If it's a contemporary work, which in Los Angeles more often than not it is, working with the artist studio or sometimes the artist's estate to make sure that the conservator is adhering to as much as possible. And that's really a huge part of what we do is managing all of these different scenarios, but understanding that our client is our client at the end of the day. And as Liza said, sometimes artists want their works to deteriorate. So how does our client fit within that that realm?
More often than not, we approach, the artist first. And if they are willing to come out and assess the work themselves, that's like best case scenario, especially for contemporary artworks. So we're always in touch with the artist studio, and that's what the conservation teams want as well. And like we said, it's about everyone working together.
All right. Now I would like to know about your personal collecting. So what's the last work you each purchased personally for your own collections?
I acquired a painting by an LA-based artist, Amy McKay, and it was actually through we are part of the art programming at the Beverly Hills Hotel and Hotel Bel Air. We work with the curator to do the logistics of the rotating exhibitions there. And the last show that was at the Beverly Hills Hotel was this show by artist Amy McKay and in collaboration with her gallery, LA Beast. And I just stared at it for like 3 months and knew I had to have it.
Well, side question on that. Is it when hotels do this sort of thing, can you actually buy the artworks or is it really just for display?
So this is a unique program at the two hotels in Los Angeles in collaboration with Lily Ackerman of Ackerman Studios, and the works are actually for sale.
Okay.
They do 3 shows a year at the Beverly Hills Hotel and 3 shows at Hotel Bel Air, and that is happening more and more with hospitality. and rotating art collections, whether it's just exhibitions for an exhibition purpose in hospitality or actually selling exhibitions within a hospitality space.
Okay. And do these artists often have galleries already, or is it a mix?
It's a mix. The shows at the Beverly Hills, this was a collaboration with Amy's gallery, but there have also been exhibitions where it's the artists representing themselves.
Okay. Sorry, sidetracked a little bit. Georgia, what about you?
So I'm a complete hypocrite in that I always sort of take a step back when anyone asks me about my own collection. And I was interviewed a couple of years ago for Artsy for a piece on young collectors. And I was like, I'm not a collector, so I'm a complete hypocrite when I'm trying to encourage people to call themselves that. But I wanted to highlight two works, actually, if that's okay. One is a piece that both Liza and I fell in love with during Echo Soho, the fair I mentioned previously. It was being shown by a wonderful gallery in London that I love their programming called Wilder. And the artist was an artist called Xanthi Burdett. And it's this very haunting figurative painting of a woman I later found out was meant to be a character from King Arthur called Lady Bertilac. And she's standing there very confidently holding what I later found to be her husband's head on a platter.
What do you mean what you later like, as in you
Well,
didn't know
because
it was her
one
husband, or
side, no, what, I mean, when I looked at it, I didn't know what on earth was going on. I was just like, what is this thing? It's incredible.
you have to send me a
And then
picture.
I will. And then I researched Lady Bertilac, who's from, as I say, the King Arthur mythologies. Um, and she beheaded her husband and is presenting it quite confidently on this platter in this painting. But more than that, it was just this kind of haunting figure that was sort of floating in this abyss. It was just, and the vibrancy of the green, it was just incredible. So there was that. And that was a real undertaking. So thankfully, wonderful Michelle let me pay in installments. But the other end of the spectrum is walking into this antique market in the town that Liza is born in, called Ojai in California, and seeing this floral painting for $150 and then my poor husband having to like bring it back to Europe, package it up. So yeah, I think that's a good example of what collecting can be. It's like, something that's a bit of an investment for you and but then also just falling in love with something at an antiques market for $150 and having to bring it home.
I love that. Very cool. So, who's one artist you're excited about, but you haven't acquired anything of theirs yet?
I was thinking about this. So many. It's really
I can imagine it's hard to choose.
so hard. But a dear friend of mine, Tawny Lonsdale, I have been wanting a painting of hers for a decade. So that was like the first thing that came to mind. She is an incredible painter that Georgia knows well too. And it's been so interesting becoming friends with Tawny and seeing her, visiting her studio over the past decade and kind of seeing how much her painting it's really shifted and changed in kind of different eras of her life. And when you know an artist personally, it's incredible to watch because you kind of know that, oh, this happened during this time in their life, and you kind of get to know them in a different way and get to know the paintings in a different way. But I would love to have a painting of hers on my wall. So that was the first thing that came to mind.
What about you, Georgia?
No, there's too many to mention. I never understand how people don't understand what they want personally. So, I mean, I feel like I'm inundated with art in my inbox on Instagram on a daily basis that if I had the resources, I would love to acquire. I can't highlight just one, to be
I know, I
honest.
totally know what you mean, and you mentioned this also at the top that there's so much, and it's
Yeah,
almost like paralyzing the
yeah,
choice because you know what you like, you kind of know what you don't like, but then you discover so many new things. I find it pretty overwhelming, if I'm honest.
yeah.
It gets to the point where I'm like, I'm not buying anything because I just can't make up my mind. But by nature, I can be quite indecisive, so maybe it's just a me problem. Okay, so how would you describe your collections in one word?
The word that came to mind very quickly is just friends. Feel like the things in my home that I live with are kind of like my pals. They come with me when I move and shift, and your home is kind of like the place that's constant, like these things that you bring with me. But I'm lucky enough to know a lot of, a lot of the artists behind the works on the
Yeah.
walls, and think of them as dear friends. So that feels fitting.
Nice.
I find the works that I've collected hugely inspiring. I'm more drawn to the figurative side of things. And as Liza said, it's like being surrounded by your friends, but then also these characters. And, you can escape into this other world, whether it's Lady Bertilac in King Arthur. It's like this. So maybe the word is either inspiring or escapism. I don't know. One of those.
You keep both. Awesome. And finally, who's a collector you personally admire? I'm sure there's many too.
So many. A collector that really stands out to me is Joy Simmons. She's an LA-based collector. She has said, there's many articles that she has said this, but she talks about like the feeling that she gets when she acquires works, and that she has to see them all in person. But her form of patronage and the way that she is constantly supporting the Los Angeles arts community, I also see her out at like so many events and talks, and I just find her ethos and her collection deeply inspiring.
And because you said personally, I took that very literally and wanted to highlight my client that I mentioned previously, the one that had Googled collecting with purpose and found us. And I feel like as I was talking about how, you evolve, you can sort of embrace the your personality as well as your work persona. And this client and I have really gone on a journey, and I've learned so much about her through that, but also about myself. And I find her hugely inspiring. And I can name her because, we've spoken about her publicly. She's done a talk with us. So she's called Henrianne Morgue Dalgu, and she's been a patron for our residency project. And the way that she goes about things with sort of her ego completely removed, it's about how can she have the greatest impact, and cares very little about what she gets back in return, because it's actually just being involved that inspires her. That's what she wants to do. She wants to have that feeling of making an impact. And I'm sure that's the same thing. There's the same approach that Joy Simmons, who's equally a collector that inspires me as well. I think it's that ethos that's going back to that. So I would like to highlight Henrianne. And I feel very lucky to work with her.
Lovely. Thank you so much. I've hugely enjoyed this.
Likewise. Thank you so
Thank
much.
you so much. It's been a pleasure.
That's it for today's episode of The Collector's Corner. If you enjoyed it, do follow the show and leave a short rating or review on Spotify or Apple Podcasts. It really helps more people find these conversations. And if you've got thoughts, feedback, or someone you think I should talk to next, I'd love to hear from you. Just drop me a message on Instagram or through the website, thecollectorscornerpodcast.com. Thank you for listening and for being part of this growing community. Until next time.